HOA tried to fine me for water overload. They said I was using too much water. A ridiculous fine for something as basic as keeping my lawn green. But they had no idea what I was planning. I wasn't going to pay that fine. No, I had a better idea. Something that would turn the tables and make them regret messing with me. So, what did I do? I unleashed the dam and destroyed her garden party. But it wasn't just about the water. It was something much bigger. You won't believe what happened next. Welcome to HOA Unit. I'm Mark, and I've got a wild story for you today. I live right here in this suburban neighborhood where everything seems perfect on the outside. But trust me, when the HOA gets involved, nothing stays perfect for long. So let's dive into the story of how a simple fine turned into a full-on war. Stick around, because this one gets crazy. I had always been the kind of person who followed the rules. I wasn't a rebel, never liked to make waves. But then, one day, I got that letter, the one with the HOA's fancy logo on it. It was thick, official looking, the kind of letter that immediately makes you feel like you're in trouble, even before you open it. I could already feel the tension building in my chest as I slid my finger under the flap, tearing it open. Inside was a formal notice, a fine for what they called excessive water usage. Excessive water usage? Are you kidding me? I had been watering my lawn, sure, but it wasn't anything crazy. It wasn't like I was running a water park in my backyard, just a couple of sprinklers running in the early morning before the sun hit. That's it. But there it was, in black and white. A fine for $100, and the note said I had violated one of the HOA's precious rules. I stood there for a moment, holding that paper in my hands, staring at the words. Excessive water usage. It didn't even make sense. I looked outside at my perfectly green lawn. Nothing too out of the ordinary, just grass and water doing its thing. But apparently my lawn was too lush, green. I had seen the other lawns around the neighborhood. Some people watered their grass too, but none of them had received a fine. None of them had been singled out. It was just me. I was the one who had been chosen. Why? It wasn't like I was wasting water or anything. It wasn't like I had a pond in my backyard. I was doing everything by the book. At least, I thought I was. But that fine hit me harder than it should have. Maybe it was because I didn't expect it. Maybe it was because I'd always followed the rules, and this time it felt like I was being punished for no reason at all. I set the paper down on the counter and walked to the window. The sun was starting to rise, casting a golden glow over the neighborhood. The kind of morning that made everything look calm and perfect. Except, my thoughts were far from calm. Why me? What had I done differently? I wasn't some wild homeowner who ignored the rules. I'd always made sure to keep things neat, to keep the lawn looking good, and to keep the peace with the HOA. But now they were coming after me for too much water? I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself down. Maybe it was a mistake, right? Maybe someone had made an error in their calculations. But the letter didn't seem like a mistake. It was too official, too serious. I picked up the phone and called the HOA office. Hello, this is the HOA office. How can I help you? I tried to stay calm as I spoke to the woman on the other end. I received a fine for excessive water usage, I said, holding the paper up to my face, and I was wondering if there's been some kind of mistake. Oh, no, sir, she said, her tone annoyingly chipper. We've had multiple reports of homeowners using too much water, and we're just trying to keep things in line. Too much water? I repeated, disbelief creeping into my voice. I'm just watering my lawn. Well, sir, it's part of the community guidelines, she said, clearly reading from a script. The HOA has decided to limit water usage to ensure everyone is following the rules. I wanted to scream. But the rules don't make sense. I understand your frustration, sir, she said, like she had said it 100 times before. But the fine stands. Please make sure to adjust your usage. And with that, she hung up. I stared at the phone for a second, feeling the anger bubbling inside me. This wasn't just about a fine anymore. It was about the principle. Who were they to tell me how much water I could use on my own lawn? But then I realized something. I wasn't the only one getting fines. It wasn't just my water usage. There were people on the block who had received notices for trivial things. One person got fined for having a mailbox that was a couple of inches too high. Another for having a lawn chair out in the front yard for a few hours on a Saturday. It was absurd. This wasn't about water. This was about control. The HOA had been making ridiculous rules for years, but this was the breaking point. I wasn't going to let them get away with it. Not this time. I took another deep breath and looked outside again. The sun was now fully up, and everything looked normal. But my mind was racing. I needed to make a decision. I needed to do something. But what? Should I just pay the fine and move on? Or should I do something more dramatic? I wasn't the type to make waves, but this time I had had enough. There had to be a way to turn the tables. But how? The thing is, I never really paid much attention to the rules before. I lived my life, kept my lawn trimmed, followed the signs, and kept to myself. That's how things were supposed to work, right? But after the fine, something inside me shifted. The more I thought about it, the angrier I got. Why was it always the small things that set the HOA off? A little water here, a lawn chair there. And why did they think they could control every aspect of my life? I stared out the window again, watching the neighbors walk by. The whole neighborhood looked like a scene out of a magazine. Pristine houses, manicured lawns, and perfect little fences. Everyone seemed so normal. But beneath the surface, I could see it. I could see the control the HOA had, the way it suffocated every ounce of freedom we were supposed to have. It wasn't about making things look nice anymore, it was about power. The HOA didn't care about what was reasonable. They cared about making sure everyone stayed in line, whether you liked it or not. I couldn't let this go. I knew I had to do something. I started paying closer attention to the little things, the small rules they had buried deep in the community guidelines. Who decides what color your mailbox can be? Who cares if your lawn is 2 inches taller than the rest of the block? I saw it now. This wasn't just about me and my water usage. This was about a system that had too much control over too many people. But I wasn't the type to just sit back and accept it. I wasn't going to let them walk all over me. So I started planning. I pulled out the fine they'd sent me, the one for excessive water usage, and I stared at it. If they wanted to play by their rules, I was going to show them what happened when someone finally decided to fight back. Now, I didn't have a grand plan yet, but I knew the first thing I needed to do was water. And I didn't just mean the lawn, I meant something much bigger. Wait, what was the point of rules if they didn't make sense? What was the point of a fine if you could flip the script and show them just how ridiculous it all was? The next morning, I went out and turned on every single sprinkler I had, and then I hooked up 2 extra hoses to make sure the water would flow everywhere it could. The lawn was already green, but now it was turning into something that looked more like a swamp. But it wasn't just the lawn. No, my plan was much bigger than that. I was going to show the HOA what it felt like to be out of control, to have something they couldn't control. The water kept flowing, and I watched as it spread out across my front yard, creeping into the sidewalk, flowing into the neighbor's garden. I was pushing the boundaries, testing just how far I could go without crossing the line. But the truth was, I wasn't just doing this for fun. I wasn't just making a mess, I was making a point. The HOA had a choice. They could either back down, or they could keep pushing. And I'd show them exactly what that looked like. What did they expect me to do? Apologize? Send in a check for the fine and move on? Not a chance. I wasn't that kind of guy. As I stood there, watching the water spread across the yard, I could hear the sound of my neighbor's sprinkler systems turning off. The silence felt oppressive, like everyone knew what I was doing, but no one wanted to admit it. The streets were eerily quiet, and I could almost feel the eyes of the HOA on me, even though they weren't anywhere nearby. I kept the water running for hours. Hours of quiet rebellion. By the time I finally turned the water off, my yard looked like a swamp. It was wet, wild, and out of control, just the way I felt. But this wasn't enough. I needed to make a statement. So I did something that would really make them notice me. I didn't just leave it at my yard. No, I made sure the water flooded the sidewalk, the streets, and even started creeping up onto her precious garden. The HOA president's garden, the one she always bragged about to everyone, was about to become part of my message. I didn't stop there. I went inside and pulled out a letter I'd been holding on to for a while. A letter that I had drafted when I first got the fine. It was a letter to the HOA, but not the kind they expected. I wasn't going to grovel. I wasn't going to apologize. I was going to send them a message, one that made it clear I was no longer playing by their rules. I didn't just complain in the letter. I told them what I thought about their fine and their so-called water restrictions. I made it clear that I wasn't going to let them tell me how to live my life, especially not when their rules made no sense. And then I sent it. I could already feel the tension building, knowing that the HOA was going to come after me for this. But I didn't care. In fact, I was looking forward to it. When they came to check on the mess I'd made, I was ready. I was standing there, arms crossed, watching them from my porch. They could fine me all they wanted, but they couldn't take back what I had done. The water, the letter, the defiance, it all felt like something I had to do. Something that would make them see me, really see me. And as I watched them approach, I couldn't help but wonder, was I going to be punished for this? Or was I going to get away with it? It wasn't just the fine anymore. It was about proving a point. They thought they could control me, that they could walk all over me, tell me what I could and couldn't do with my own property. Well, I wasn't going to let that happen. The more I thought about the letter, the more ridiculous it became. Water overload? Who even cares? People across the neighborhood were using just as much water, and they weren't getting fined. But here I was, the lucky one, the one who had to fight back. I decided it was time to take things a step further. I wasn't just going to water my lawn. No, I was going to drown it. And not just my lawn, either. I was going to make sure every inch of my property, and hers too, was covered in water. I woke up early the next morning, knowing this would be the day I turned everything upside down. I went straight to the shed, grabbed every sprinkler I had, and set them up all over the yard. The plan was simple: flood everything, make it look like a swamp. But I didn't just want the grass to get watered. I wanted the sidewalk to look like it had just rained for hours. The neighbor's garden, the one that the HOA president took so much pride in, was going to be right in the middle of this mess. I didn't even bother with the hose at first. I wanted to make a statement, not just water the lawn. I connected 2 sprinklers to a single pipe, then added a third to make sure that water poured into every corner. And I didn't stop there. I took the hose and snaked it around the corner, running it all the way down the sidewalk to the end of the block. By the time I was done, water was rushing everywhere, flowing through the gutters like a small river. It spread across the yard, pooling under the trees, and reaching the edge of the sidewalk where her garden started. I wasn't even watching the clock anymore. I was too focused on what I was doing, what I was about to make happen. Every drop of water felt like a drop of defiance against the rules they had set. Every sprinkler that sprayed water onto the sidewalk felt like a victory, even though the war had just begun. But the thing was, I wasn't just trying to get back at the HOA president. No, I wasn't that petty. It wasn't about the garden, or the fine, or the water anymore. It was about taking control, about showing them that I wasn't going to let them decide how I lived my life anymore. I took a step back and looked at the chaos I had created. The water was everywhere now, filling up every corner of my yard. The neighbor's garden had been completely soaked, and I smiled to myself. But something inside me told me this wasn't enough. I had to make sure they felt it. The HOA, that is. I had to make sure they understood just how ridiculous their rules really were. I grabbed my phone, and in a moment of inspiration, I started typing. I wasn't going to just send a letter this time. No, I was going to make sure everyone knew exactly what was going on. I typed out a message to the HOA's email, detailing everything I had done. Not to brag, but to show them exactly what their little rules had driven me to. I hope you enjoy the extra water flow around the neighborhood. Consider this my response to your ridiculous fine for excessive water usage. As per your rules, I followed every single guideline, but I guess not watering enough is the crime here. Enjoy the swamp. I hit send, feeling a sense of satisfaction I hadn't felt in days. I wasn't just fighting back anymore. I was making them notice. I went outside and walked down to the sidewalk, watching the water flow freely. I could already hear the sounds of the HOA president's footsteps, probably on her way over to my house to demand answers. And yet I wasn't worried. Not anymore. In fact, I was looking forward to it. The best part? I knew this wasn't just a small rebellion. This was going to be the moment the HOA realized they weren't invincible. They couldn't control everyone. Not me, not anymore. As I stood there, water flowing freely around my feet, I couldn't help but wonder, would they finally back down? Or would they come after me harder? How far would they go to make sure everyone followed their ridiculous rules? The morning after I sent that email, I woke up to a pounding on my door. I knew exactly who it was. No need to even check the peephole. The HOA president, her perfect, controlled hair, and that look of righteous anger only someone in power could have. Her presence alone told me everything I needed to know. She was furious. I had pushed too far, and now she was here to make sure I knew it. I opened the door slowly, as if I had all the time in the world. She stood there, arms crossed, eyes glaring. "I'm here to speak to you about the swamp you've created," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. I could see the veins in her neck tight and pulsing with every word she spoke. She was clearly losing control, and I loved it. "I hope you're proud of yourself," she continued. "You've not only broken the rules, but you've wasted valuable resources. This is absurd, and I'm here to make sure you understand the consequences of your actions." I raised an eyebrow and leaned against the doorframe. "Resources? You mean water?" Her eyes flashed. "Exactly. And do you know how much that water costs? How many of us have to be responsible?" I couldn't help but smile. "I'm just doing my part to keep things green. You know, fighting for a healthy environment." She wasn't having it. "This isn't about keeping things green," she snapped. "This is about a blatant disregard for the community's rules, and you will pay for it." I could feel the tension building, the storm ready to break, but I wasn't backing down. "What do you want me to do?" I asked, trying to sound innocent. "I followed your guidelines, didn't I? I watered my lawn, just like you said." Her lips tightened into a thin line. "This is no longer about a simple lawn violation. We are talking about deliberate defiance now, and I'm not going to let you get away with it." I could almost see the wheels turning in her head as she went through her next steps. "I've already called the board," she continued, "and we are escalating this situation. You'll be receiving a legal notice soon. The HOA doesn't tolerate such behavior, and we are well within our rights to take action." I felt a cold chill run down my spine, but it wasn't fear. It was more of a challenge. So they were going to bring in the legal team. Fine by me. I wasn't about to let her scare me off. She turned to walk away, but I called out, "Hey, don't forget to tell the board that I'm just getting started." She didn't even look back. I knew I had pushed her to her limits. But what would the board do now? Over the next few days, the tension kept growing. I knew the HOA would retaliate. But what would their next move be? Sure enough, I received the legal notice in the mail. A whole packet, thick with forms, warnings, and threats. The fine was only part of it. They were demanding compensation for the water usage, too. At first, I was stunned. They wanted me to pay for every drop of water I had used. They claimed I had caused a public disturbance with my lawn being overwatered. They even had the nerve to say I'd contributed to environmental waste. I had to laugh. This was getting ridiculous. But I couldn't just laugh this off. They were serious about this, and I was about to find out just how far they were willing to go. I walked into the living room, holding the thick packet in my hands, and sat down. I stared at the papers, the legal jargon that was supposed to intimidate me, and I made a decision. I wasn't going to back down. I wasn't going to let them control me with threats and intimidation. Instead, I would turn the tables again. The next day, I began gathering everything I needed to fight back. I pulled out all my community guidelines, notes from the HOA meetings, and every email they'd ever sent me. I started looking for any loopholes, any inconsistencies, and believe me, I found a few. First of all, they were charging me for more water than I had actually used. I didn't know it at the time, but the HOA had been tracking water usage in the neighborhood without informing anyone. Turns out they had been overestimating the water usage for months. They were inflating the numbers, and that wasn't even the worst part. There were also some serious violations of their own bylaws. They had failed to properly notify residents about the water restrictions. The fine they had issued me didn't even follow their own procedures. The more I looked into it, the more I realized the HOA had been abusing their power for a long time. It wasn't just me they had targeted, it was a pattern. They were fining people for the most ridiculous things, all while pocketing the money and not following their own rules. This was bigger than just my lawn. This was about taking down the system that had been bullying us all, and I wasn't going to let them get away with it. I made up my mind that I was going to fight back, but I wasn't going to do it the usual way. I wasn't just going to hire a lawyer and go through all the usual channels. No, I was going to use their own system against them. I was going to turn their game around, and when I did, they would have no choice but to back down. But before I could do anything, I needed one thing, something they couldn't ignore. I needed proof. I went around the neighborhood talking to other residents who had also been fined. I wanted to know if they had experienced anything similar. Turns out I wasn't the only one. I wasn't even close. People were tired of the fines, tired of the rules, tired of living under the constant threat of being punished for things that didn't matter. And so I started organizing. I wasn't alone in this anymore. I had a whole neighborhood behind me. But I had to wonder, what would the HOA do once they realized they were no longer the ones in control? Would they fight harder to protect their power, or would they give up? It was only a matter of time before the HOA found out just how far I was willing to go. I could feel it in the air. The tension was thick. Every day I watched as my neighbors looked at me differently. Some were scared, others curious, but none of them had the guts to do anything about it. Except me. By now, the HOA had escalated things, sending their legal team to send me threats. I didn't care. They had messed with the wrong guy. But it wasn't just about me anymore. It was about sending a message, not just to the HOA, but to anyone who thought they could control the lives of homeowners like us. I couldn't back down. I had become a symbol of resistance. whether I liked it or not. But I wasn't just fighting for myself. I was fighting for everyone who had ever been fined for something as ridiculous as a mailbox being an inch too high or a lawn chair left out too long. The more I thought about it, the angrier I got. The more I realized I had to finish what I started. I decided that the next move had to be big. I couldn't just sit there while the HOA tried to intimidate me with legal threats and empty promises. No, I was going to take things to the next level. I went to the back of my yard and started setting up the plan. The same hoses, the same sprinklers, the same idea. Only this time, I wasn't just watering my lawn. I was going to flood the entire neighborhood. But here's the twist. I wasn't going to just use my backyard for the message. I was going to use their precious garden as well. I had seen how much the HOA president took pride in that garden, always flaunting it like it was some kind of sacred ground. It wasn't about the water anymore. It was about making sure they saw that I wasn't backing down, so I turned the water on and let it flow. It started slow at first, just a small stream of water, but soon enough it picked up pace. The water flowed over the sidewalk, around the trees, and into the garden where the HOA president prided herself on her flawless flowers. I smiled to myself as I saw the water start to creep up her flower beds. This was it. This was the moment she'd finally understand what it felt like to lose control. I didn't stop there, though. I had a whole plan in mind. I made sure to let the water run for hours. I didn't care about the consequences. I didn't care if the water bill was outrageous. This was about making her see how ridiculous her obsession with control was. I looked at the damage I had caused, and for a moment, I almost felt guilty. But then I thought about all the other people who had been targeted by the HOA, all the neighbors who had to live by their petty rules. This wasn't just about one garden. It was about showing them that they couldn't control everything. It was about the bigger picture. The water was everywhere now, flooding the streets, creeping into every corner of her garden, and slowly taking over the neighborhood like a tidal wave. I wasn't just messing with her garden anymore. I was messing with her world. I sat back on my porch, watching it all unfold. I didn't even need to say anything. The message was clear. But as the hours passed and the water continued to flow, I started to wonder. What would she do? Would she finally get the hint? Would she call the cops? Or would she take things even further and call in the full force of the HOA? I didn't care. I wasn't scared. In fact, I was enjoying it. For the first time in a long while, I felt free. As the water finally started to subside, I knew I had done something irreversible. There was no going back now, and I was ready for whatever the HOA would throw at me next. But there was one thing I hadn't anticipated. I hadn't expected the neighborhood to get involved. It started with whispers, small conversations here and there. Neighbors who had been afraid to speak up before started walking past my house with smiles on their faces, nodding in approval. Some of them even gave me a thumbs up. It was like I had ignited something. But here's the twist. I was starting to realize that this wasn't just about the HOA anymore. This wasn't just my battle. It was everyone's. So as I sat on the porch watching the remnants of the water, I had to ask myself, had I gone too far? Or had I just started something that could change everything? The storm was coming, and I knew it. I could feel it in the air, the kind of tension that builds before something big happens, the kind of moment where you don't know whether to brace for impact or just let it all unfold. I had flooded her precious garden. I had taken the fight to her doorstep. But the question remained, would I win or would I be crushed under the weight of the HOA's power? I thought about it all morning as I sat by the window, staring at the street. The water had finally drained from my yard, but the ripple effect was still there, both literally and figuratively. I'd made my statement. I had acted with purpose. But now I wondered if the HOA would come back harder than I imagined. Then the knock on my door came. It wasn't a normal knock. It was sharp, urgent, like they were sending a message that couldn't be ignored. I opened the door, and there she was, the HOA president, standing with 2 other board members at her side. They didn't look like they were here to have a friendly chat. No, this was the moment I had been dreading, and yet anticipating. She didn't waste any time. "You've taken this too far," she said, her voice ice cold. Her eyes were wild, filled with something I couldn't quite place, rage, frustration, or maybe fear. "We tried to be reasonable," she continued, "but now you've forced our hand. We're taking this to court." I could feel the blood rush to my head. They were serious. This wasn't just a neighborhood dispute anymore. They were going to make me pay, and I wasn't sure what that would look like. Court? I was about to be dragged into an HOA lawsuit because I watered my lawn a little too much. I wasn't scared. No, I was angry. I looked at them, a half smile creeping onto my face. "You really think this is going to scare me?" I couldn't help it. The satisfaction of watching her squirm was something I didn't even know I wanted. But there was something else. Something deeper. The more they tried to control me, the more I realized I had control over them. "Bring it on," I said, stepping aside to let them into my house. "If you think you can bully me into silence, think again." They walked inside, the air thick with the kind of quiet you only feel when things are about to change forever. One of the board members, a man I didn't recognize, spoke up, his voice stern. "You need to understand. This isn't a simple fine anymore. You're jeopardizing the whole neighborhood's safety and stability. People like you. You're making it harder for all of us." I looked at him, unimpressed. "Jeopardizing? I'm making your rules look ridiculous. And honestly, you've been abusing your power for far too long." There it was. The words I had been holding in for days, weeks even. They didn't want to hear it, but I was ready to speak my truth. "Do you even realize how petty your rules are? How much damage you've done to this neighborhood with your fines? People are afraid to live here. And for what? A mailbox being an inch too high? A lawn chair in the front yard?" The HOA president looked at me like I had slapped her in the face. "You don't understand the bigger picture," she snapped. "The HOA's job is to keep the neighborhood in order. If everyone starts breaking the rules, it'll all fall apart." I laughed, the sound of it echoing through the room. Fall apart? It's already falling apart. You've created a world where everyone is too afraid to live their own lives. You want control, but you've lost it. And I'm not the only one who sees that. The silence that followed was deafening. Then, she did something unexpected. She took a deep breath, letting the anger simmer for just a moment. "I didn't want it to come to this," she said quietly, almost as if she was speaking to herself. "But you forced our hand. The legal team is already involved. You'll be hearing from us soon." I could feel the energy shift in the room. It was a turning point. They weren't just angry anymore. They were afraid, and that realization hit me harder than anything else. They were afraid of me, of what I represented, of the power I had over them by simply refusing to back down. And then, before they could say anything more, I did something I hadn't planned. I picked up my phone and hit record. "I want everything on the record," I said, holding the phone up. "If you're going to take me to court, I'm going to make sure everyone knows what's really going on here." The HOA president's eyes widened. "You're recording us?" she hissed. "I am," I said, grinning. "And if you think for 1 second I'm going to let you walk all over me, you've got another thing coming." There was no turning back now. I had made my choice. I wasn't just fighting for myself anymore. I was fighting for everyone who had ever been pushed around by HOA. And I wasn't going to stop until I had made sure the whole neighborhood knew what had been happening behind closed doors. As I stood there, recording every word, I couldn't help but wonder, would they back down? Would they actually go to court over a silly water dispute? Or would they realize they had made a huge mistake? Everything I had done had led up to this moment. The water, the garden, the recording, it had all built to this grand finale. The HOA had made a mistake thinking they could intimidate me, but I had flipped the script. I wasn't backing down. I had exposed their hypocrisy, their pettiness, and now it was their turn to feel the heat. I couldn't help but grin as the legal threats kept pouring in. Letters, emails, calls. They couldn't handle the heat anymore. But what I hadn't expected was how quickly the tables would turn. I didn't have to fight them in court. I didn't even have to wait for a judge to rule. The pressure from the community itself, from my neighbors, was enough to make the HOA crumble. It all started with that recording. I uploaded the video to social media, not expecting much, but I wanted the world to see what they had been doing to people like me. Within hours, it went viral. People across the neighborhood started sharing it. It wasn't just the HOA that was being exposed. It was the whole system. The entire community started waking up, realizing they weren't alone. For the first time in years, someone had finally stood up to them, and not just stood up, fought back. The phone calls started pouring in. Neighbors I hadn't even spoken to before started reaching out, thanking me for doing what they couldn't. I was a hero to some, a troublemaker to others. But I didn't care. I had struck a chord, and once a chord is struck, there's no unstriking it. But then came the twist I hadn't anticipated. A week after the video went viral, I got a call from the HOA's legal team. They wanted to settle. They called me, not to threaten, but to make an offer. They told me they'd drop the fine and the legal proceedings if I agreed to a public apology and cooperation with the neighborhood. They wanted me to be the one to back down, to admit I had gone too far. But I wasn't about to play that game. I didn't pick this fight to back down. I didn't flood her garden to apologize. So I did something even better. I called a meeting. I invited every single homeowner who had ever been fined for something trivial to come and speak. We all gathered in the community hall, and I made sure to have a video camera ready, this time for the HOA's response. The president showed up, and she was livid. But when she saw the turnout, the dozens of people who had gathered, it was clear she knew she had lost. I stood there in front of everyone with a microphone in my hand. "I'm not going to apologize," I said, staring right at the president, "but you will apologize, to everyone here, and to everyone you've ever tried to control." The look on her face said it all. She knew she was out of options. She was cornered. In that moment, she realized she wasn't the one in control anymore. It wasn't just me standing up to her. It was everyone who had ever been bullied by her little empire. And when she tried to speak, to defend herself, the crowd shut her down. The residents who had been silent for years were now vocal, now demanding accountability. They weren't afraid of her anymore. They weren't afraid of the fines. They weren't afraid of the HOA. After hours of back and forth, the HOA finally agreed to rescind all the fines. The water fine? Gone. The threat of court? Gone. And in exchange, I did something even better. I didn't back down. I made sure they knew what real power looked like. The HOA president, the legal team, and the entire board had to publicly admit their mistakes. They had to apologize to the residents for their overreach. That was the real victory. Not the fine, not the water, not the garden.